The idea that human beings could age backwards has long fascinated storytellers, philosophers, and scientists alike, and if such a reality were to exist, it would challenge everything we thought we knew about life, time, and the human journey itself. To imagine a world where individuals came into existence not as fragile infants destined to grow older and more frail, but instead as aged beings who slowly became more agile, more youthful, and more resilient as the years passed, is to confront the very boundaries between what we accept as natural and what seems to belong only in myth or fiction. Yet, from the very first moment such a possibility is considered, there is an undeniable allure, a magnetic pull that opens up a realm of speculation, curiosity, and even wonder, and in that curiosity lies the foundation for exploring the Benjamin Button reality not as a story confined to pages or films, but as a thought experiment that extends into questions about biology, society, and meaning. If at birth a human being were to appear elderly, worn, and bent with the marks of time, only to reverse those physical and cognitive footprints steadily with each passing year, one could ask whether life itself would feel more like a journey from wisdom toward innocence, rather than from innocence toward wisdom. The conventional arc of the human experience, which we so often take for granted, follows a forward-moving line anchored by biology. Cells divide, DNA accumulates damage, the body matures, peaks, and eventually deteriorates until the inevitable end. But in a reality where time seems to flow backward within our very cells, such a progression would not merely be inverted in stages of the flesh. It would dismantle the way we define beginnings and endings, the way we attach meaning to growth and decline, and the way we understand the cycle of human connections. To begin life at its natural conclusion and to conclude life at the fragile beginning would throw into question all that we call purpose, yet it also shines with the possibility of rewriting existence in extraordinary ways. The opening of such a speculative journey invites us to gently lay aside the constraints of our ordinary thinking and consider what timelessness might feel like when its rhythm beats in reverse. In our ordinary reality, people glance into the mirror each year, noticing changes that accumulate in subtle but undeniable directions, lines forming around the eyes, gray trickling into once dark strands of hair, the energy of youth shifting into slower, measured steps. But to imagine that reflection slowly smoothing out, that hair darkening back to its youthful shade, that vitality flowing into the muscles not as they strain with time but as they renew themselves, is to imagine a gift of existence that seems miraculously benevolent. Yet beneath that surface delight lies a riddle, for such a life would be unfamiliar in its burdens as much as in its promises, and it forces us to hold the balance between enchantment and unease. From the very foundation of the concept comes the tension between reality as we know it and the strange potential that such an inversion would offer. We define much of our personal identity by our age, by the shared milestones we cross together as generations rise, mature, and pass into history. Our culture celebrates birthdays as markers not only of existence, but of the privilege of surviving one more revolution around the sun. Yet, what would it mean to celebrate in reverse? Would each birthday feel like a restoration, like stepping a little closer toward a renewed beginning? Or would it feel like a melancholy descent into helpless dependency, a reminder that each regained strength is only borrowed, and that at the end of this reverse journey lies not triumphant endurance, but the helpless fragility of infancy once more? Such notions are not simple thought games, they go to the very root of how humans structure meaning, family, and memory. The idea of reverse aging is not only haunting because it twists our understanding of life's arc, it is also seductive because it contains within it our most ancient dream, the dream of avoiding the indignities of growing old, the dream of clinging to youth, the dream that age might be conquered, or at least rearranged, into something more forgiving. Across cultures and centuries, mankind has searched for fountains of youth, elixirs of immortality, or secret pathways to eternal vitality. Legends of explorers seeking magical springs, tales of emperors commanding alchemists to find concoctions of life, stories of sorcerers reaching for immortality through forbidden arts, all of these mirror a longing embedded so deeply in human consciousness that it seems inseparable from who we are. The Benjamin Button reality simply transforms that yearning into a narrative pattern we can easily picture, not the halting of time, but the smoothing of it, not the defiance of aging by freezing it in place, but the quiet reversal of its flow like a film running backwards through a projector until the opening frame is once more revealed. And yet, the deeper we lean into this idea, the more we see both the beauty and the tragedy that such a reversal would bring. Consider the relationships that form across a lifetime. When a person is born in ordinary circumstances, they are nurtured, guided, and taught by those who came before them. Their parents lift them, their guardians protect them, and from that foundational vulnerability, a community of care is born. But in a world running backwards, a child would not be vulnerable in the same way. That being would emerge into the world wrinkled and weary, perhaps even carrying the quiet gravity of age that most of us only glimpse near the end. Parents would gaze upon a face that showed signs of years surpassing their own, and yet, they would know that behind those appearances lay an innocence waiting to unfold. Imagine the strangeness of holding a newborn who looks like a great-grandparent, of cradling wrinkles and fragility while knowing that the path ahead is one of vigor steadily returning. It is a psychological paradox that unsettles as much as it intrigues, making us wonder whether our instinct to protect youth comes from vulnerability, or whether it might persist even when the vulnerable form is replaced with something visibly ancient. Nor does the paradox stop with the family unit. In a society where reverse aging were the rule, communities would redefine what it means to grow together. Friendships would be formed between individuals whose outward appearances were perpetually shifting in complicated ways, sometimes older in face but younger in spirit, sometimes younger in body but older in memory. A lover in such a society might find themselves holding the hand of someone who looks youthful but carries within them centuries of perspective, or someone who looks aged but stands emotionally on the very threshold of adolescence. Such bonds would be tested not through the familiar arc of time but through a sliding, disorienting exchange of appearances and emotional depth. The very notion of generations would collapse, for how would one define a generation if elders were destined to end their days lying in cradles, as helpless infants in the hands of those they once produced? This inversion also forces us to reflect upon knowledge, memory, and wisdom. In our timeline, humans build knowledge as they grow, storing the lessons of youth and the mistakes of maturity, and hopefully carrying them all into elderhood with a perspective that becomes the gift of age. An elder becomes a vessel for stories, for continuity, for advice that can steer the young away from paths too dangerous or unwise. But if one moves backward, the question arises of what happens to those memories. Would someone who grows downwards into childhood retain the wisdom of their former years? Or would memory itself unravel, each decade peeling away insights until the mind becomes once more a blank slate? If so, then reverse aging is not only playful fantasy but tragic erosion, a reminder that even as the body renews itself, the soul's accumulation of meaning evaporates just as surely as the clock ticks backward. Even so, this speculation is not meant to dismiss the enchantment it offers. Just as people delight in the thought of a second springtime, of escaping aches and pains by watching them dissolve, of seeing vitality seep back into the skin and bones, so too can imagination dwell on sensory wonders. Imagine walking into a park and noticing that each day your stride became quicker, more confident, more energized, while others around you mirrored the same progression. Imagine speaking with friends and realizing that their voices, formerly crackling and subdued, began to rise again with clarity, pitch, and resonance. Imagine meals that once felt heavy now nourishing you with effortless efficiency, as if the body itself remembered the grace of youth. Such a vision brings serenity to the heart, the tantalizing hope that decline is not the ultimate narrative. And while tragic questions remain, these moments of fantasy still remind us of humanity's endless hunger for ways to reshape the story of mortality. As we drift deeper into this thought experiment, it becomes clear that the Benjamin Button reality is not merely about turning back a biological clock. It is about reshaping the entire architecture of human meaning. It asks not how we might live differently, but how we would love differently, how we would suffer differently, and how we would define joy or purpose when the dance of time moves in reverse. The comfort of imagining such a life is its ability to soothe our universal fear of aging. The unease of imagining it is its ability to reveal that time's arrow, whether forward or backward, always carries with it limits we cannot escape. In embracing the strange paradox, we recognize that life, in any direction, is precious, and that perhaps the act of imagining itself, of letting the mind wander into such a dreamlike possibility, offers us comfort during sleepless hours when eternity feels closer than we dare admit. And so, as you listen in stillness, allow your mind to wander through this gentle doorway, where speculation and wonder replace ordinary logic, and where the idea of human beings who age backward becomes not simply a story, but a lullaby made of imagination. Close your eyes as the thought unfolds. Picture the first breath as a sigh from an elderly chest. Picture the journey continuing into returning vigor. Picture once more the cycle completing as innocence overtakes experience. In that picture lives not only the strangeness of an alternate world, but also the reassurance that in any world, forward or backward, existence is both fleeting and extraordinary. Drift with it, let curiosity melt into calmness, let possibility dissolve into relaxation. The story begins, and as time bends in your imagination, so too does the mind drift slowly, gently, into rest. Aging, in the reality we know, is a universal certainty, a biological process so deeply woven into the fabric of existence that we rarely stop to ask why it happens or how it could possibly be different. From the moment a human being comes into the world, every cell begins marching along a preordained path, carrying instructions encoded in DNA that determine growth, maturity, and ultimately decline. The skin that is smooth in infancy thickens, stretches, and eventually folds. The bones that elongate and strengthen are destined to become porous and fragile. The brain that blossoms into staggering complexity weakens over time, memories blurring and impulses slowing. To understand what it would mean to live in a reverse timeline, one must first deeply reflect on this forward progression, for it is only by seeing the inevitability of nature's current design that the curiosity of its reversal takes on its full weight. At the heart of aging lies the dance of cellular life, small units that replicate tirelessly from the earliest stages of embryonic development. Every division of a cell carries both the promise of continuation and the shadow of loss, for within the chromosome strands are protective caps known as telomeres. Each division shortens these telomeres until eventually, the ends fray, the instructions falter, and the cells can no longer reproduce with youthful precision. Over years, trillions of those small endings erode, like sand slipping out of an invisible hourglass, and the result manifests as wrinkles, fatigue, disease, and decline. Aging, then, is not some cruel act imposed suddenly but a tapestry of countless microscopic inevitabilities, each carrying us gently but firmly toward the slowing of every function. In this process, we witness both the wonder of biology and the fragility of its limits, marveling at how sophisticated nature is, while also confronting the fact that perfection was never its goal. Life was designed not to last forever, but to burn brightly for a time, then make way for cycles that follow. To imagine a reality where these steps reversed requires looking closer at all the elements we take for granted. Consider the mitochondria, the energy converters of the body, tirelessly fueling every organ with bursts of ATP. In the youth of life, these engines roar with efficiency, their internal turbines spinning freely, giving us strength enough to leap, run, create, and dream. As time passes, however, mitochondria accumulate damage, their efficiency waning, producing not vigorous waves of energy but byproducts like reactive oxygen species that slowly, invisibly, chip away at the machinery. The whole body feels the dimming of this invisible flame, muscles tire more easily, recovery slows, the very cells fall behind in their duties. Now, if backward aging were to govern these processes, we would see a slow restoration of mitochondrial power, like turbines growing cleaner with every passing day. The elderly form, weary and heavy upon birth, would steadily burn off its fatigue by cellular renewal, and each year of youth regained would feel like a victory not of stasis, but of gradual self-healing. Yet biology is not only a matter of single cells acting alone, it is an orchestra where organs rise and fall in intricate harmony. The cardiovascular system, for instance, builds strength early in life, arteries elastic and pliable, hearts beating with efficiency that allows endless endurance. But inevitably, rigidity sets in, arteries stiffen, cholesterol accumulates, and the conducting vessel grows prone to disruption. If this arc were reversed, each tightening would slacken, each blockage would resolve, as though the body were a symphony gently untangling itself with every measure in reverse. What feels universal today, the slowing pulse of age, the wheezing lungs of elderhood, would bloom instead into expanded lung capacity and robust circulation. The body would no longer prepare for rest but instead for renewal, until one wonders, would vigor be more intoxicating if it came not at the start of life but as something one grew daily closer to achieving? Even the brain, that vast theater of consciousness, offers striking contrasts between its youth and age. In the early stages of life, neurons explode with connectivity, synaptic pathways multiply, and the mind absorbs knowledge and sensation as though it were a sponge dipped into the sea. Over decades, however, this abundance gradually prunes itself away. Efficiency is gained, yes, but doors close as synaptic connections wither. Ultimately, age brings decline, memory falters, reaction slows, clarity dims. Inverting this journey would give us a consciousness that, at the apparent beginning of existence, would feel weighted, clouded, perhaps heavy with lethargy. Yet, as years pressed forward, clarity would return. Each moment would feel crisper than the last, a gift of rejuvenating focus. Memory would not fade but sharpen, curiosity would rise, attention would bloom, as though life itself were an expanding corridor of learning into endless possibility. Would such a mind view the world differently? Would joy not be more vibrant if each year promised an increase, not a loss, in the richness of perception? When one reflects further, the inevitability of mortality comes into focus, for the body has always been destined toward its final decline. Death crowns the human timeline, closing it with solemnity. In a reversed arc, however, what does death become? to end one's journey as an infant poses unsettling enigmas. The forward life ends in frailty, yes, but with memory, personality, and a lifetime of bonds intact. The backward life ends instead with helplessness so profound that the self itself dissolves long before breath surrenders. Would memory shrink back into the ether? Would identity vanish into the fog of fading neurons, until the final moment mirrored the blank canvas that just began? Such notions force us to confront the meaning of existence not as a straight line, but as an hourglass poured both ways. In both universes, the endpoint is fragility. In both, identity passes away. But in one, it fades after decades of expansion, and in the other, it evaporates by degrees into a beginning so strange it feels like another ending in disguise. This meditation is not idle curiosity, it is rooted in the scientific attempts humanity already pursues to unravel aging itself. Researchers examine cellular senescence, those instances where cells stop dividing but resist dying, filling the body with stagnant fragments that disrupt healthy function. Scientists probe the unlocking of telomerase, an enzyme that could effectively rewind the ends of DNA, tricking cells into acting young again. Laboratories explore the reprogramming of stem cells, daring to reverse their clocks so tissues might heal without limit. In these pursuits, we glimpse the alluring shadow of reverse aging, not in myth, but in controlled experiments of biology itself. Yet in each success lies a question: even if we could, should we? If backwardness became attainable, would it be a blessing of rebirth or a curse of endless disorientation? The complexity of the human body ensures that there is never a single clock ticking but 1,000 rhythms aligning into aging's symphony. Bones mineralize, then steadily demineralize. Muscles construct fibers, only for those fibers to slowly atrophy. Hormones surge in youth, then gradually ebb in elder years. In reverse, these flows would seem to transform the experience of life into an unfolding miracle where every day introduces more capacity, more fertility, more stamina. The excitement of adolescence would arrive last, transforming the middle point of existence into an apex of possibility. Old age would not confine but liberate, and adolescence would mark not the first step into adulthood, but the final achievement before helpless infancy. How strange to imagine the peak of life near its terminus, to glimpse all human potential shining brightest just before silence takes it away. And once more the mind wanders into the mystery of memory. For if biology can be imagined to move backward, what of the subjective experience of consciousness? Would the mind itself also rewind, shedding memories as the body grows younger? Or would the internal archive persist, creating a paradox where the youngest body holds the oldest wisdom, where an infant's gaze could carry decades of insight? Both possibilities are haunting. If wisdom fades into oblivion, then life is robbed of continuity. But if it remains intact, society must reconcile the uncanniness of infants speaking with ancient eloquence, children recalling the struggles of their declining years that now feel distant, teenagers bearing the paradox of newly vibrant bodies yet carrying awareness of the inevitable reversion. In either case, the spectrum of meaning is disoriented, but perhaps therein lies fascination. In pondering this alternate reality, we also glimpse ourselves in clearer ways. We see the fragility of the life we know, how intimately connected it is to decline, and how much of our social structures are built upon this shared journey forward into age. We recognize the way families share milestones linked to growth and decline, how societies honor birthdays, retirements, memorials, and heritage with rituals that require time to move forward, not backward. Imagining this reversal disrupts the comfort of those patterns, forcing us to reconstruct what it means to live meaningfully when the markers are fundamentally inverted. Perhaps, then, the Benjamin Button thought experiment is less about biology than about reflection. It asks us not if such a life could exist, but how we value the life we already hold, with all its fragile, fleeting movement toward inevitable endings. As these thoughts settle into rhythm, one begins to sense the comfort of such exploration. Even if impossible, the contemplation itself creates a form of release, an acceptance that aging, whether forward or reversed, is an essential pattern. To think of the body like a clock moving backward is to understand that existence can be seen from multiple directions, each perspective yielding new insights and new tranquility. The mind wanders between fascination and calm, between speculative science and whispered philosophy, and in this wandering the very act of reflection becomes soothing. Lying in quiet thought, one can almost feel the reversal, as though breath itself were a tide moving outward and back, carrying with it the edges of possibility. And so the journey continues, letting each image of reverse aging form slowly as though in a dream. The cells repair themselves in quiet succession. The body, weary at first, opens gradually into strength. The mind sharpens rather than dulls. Family bonds twist into paradox and love reshapes itself according to strange new rules. Society reforms its traditions, memory dances with disappearance, and death itself wears another mask. All of it illuminates not only how strange life could be, but how remarkable it already is. Let each thought drift like a wave coming gently to shore, receding into the next, carrying you deeper into calm. The story is not one of fast conclusions but slow horizons. Time itself is bending here, and while you listen, it is enough to float upon its surface, reflecting, wondering, resting, drifting. To imagine a world in which the arrow of life turns in the opposite direction requires us to step even deeper into the mechanics of time as it coils through the human body, into the places where biology, imagination, and philosophy blur so completely that one begins to feel as though ordinary definitions are dissolving. If the previous reflection led us into the mysteries of how aging unfolds in the forward march, then the next unfolding thought is to linger with the tantalizing question of what it would really mean to turn that march back on itself. What happens if the human organism discovers within itself the power to restore not only its tissues but the very rhythm of its existence, if the knots of change loosen and unravel instead of tying tighter over the decades? This thought does not remain only in the realm of vague fantasy, it situates itself precisely at the threshold of what modern science already dares to probe. Where biology whispers of reversibility, where laboratories dream of renewal, one senses the possibility of genuine pathways toward a mirror-like inversion of age. Scientists who carefully trace the frontiers of cellular biology uncover facts that resonate almost like myth, yet they emerge from experiments done under microscopes, not from the pages of fairy tales. At the core of these discoveries is the recognition that the cell, the smallest organized unit of life, is not a static machine but something more like a flame, flickering between strength and exhaustion. For centuries, humans assumed that aging was immutable, that the body inevitably wore out like a garment, its fabric impossible to repair. But deeper study revealed signs that some threads could, in fact, be rewoven, and that hidden inside the genome itself were instructions not only for decline but for renewal. The language of youth is preserved within every cell, needing only the right conditions to be awakened. Telomerase, for instance, has been shown to lengthen the chopped ends of chromosomes, resuscitating divisions that had long seemed spent. Cellular reprogramming, applying cocktails of transcription factors, has been able to restore elderly cells to pluripotent states, their clocks seemingly pulled backward until they gleam once more with vitality. Each glimpse of these reversals stirs something ancient and comforting, something that suggests that age is not a straight corridor but a maze with more doors than we once believed. And yet, what would happen if these techniques did not merely reverse isolated cells but the entire human fabric, so that a life was lived wholly in backward unfolding? To imagine this broader transformation is to consider the strangeness of development not as progress but regression. Muscles would not grow by effort and maturity, they would peel away fatigue as if guided by memory returning to earlier vigor. The mind would not blossom by accumulating experience but by restoring lost clarity, sweeping away debris like the tide revealing a beach beneath layers of silt. Each stage of living would shimmer with paradox. Adolescence would not mark the beginning of desire but its culmination. Maturity would not signal the peak of responsibility but an unburdening, a dissipation of weight as body and mind undo what they had built. This inversion would carry profound emotional resonance. Birth, under such a system, becomes simultaneously arrival and conclusion. The parents would greet not innocence but the weary vessel of experience. They would cradle the footprints of a lifetime rather than the blank slate of potential. As days pass, however, they would witness transformation, a loved one shedding wrinkles as though pulling off a cloak of time. Bones would firm, skin would brighten, energy would bloom. What parent would not find awe in such daily miracles, even as an undertone of sorrow whispered that this direction promised not growth into independence but regression into helplessness? The family would stand watch over a chronology running backward, a loved one who with each year grew less wise, less burdened by memory, more playful, and more dependent, until the final day, when the cycle closed in an infant's breath. The psychological terrain of such a reality would be extraordinary. Imagine relationships where individuals knew always that their partner was not moving toward deepening understanding, but toward its dissolution. Imagine conversations where the stories shared grew fewer each year, where insights diminished, where the wisdom carried by the body at birth slowly evaporated until childish laughter replaced solemn reflection. In such a society, the value of time would be inverted. The earlier years would be cherished for their accumulated gravity, while later years would be treasured for their fleeting innocence before it disappeared into silence. There would be festivals not for graduations and weddings but perhaps for the moments when memory still lingered, when clarity persisted just before it flickered out. The calendar of human rites and rituals would be written backward, yet still profoundly moving, perhaps even more so because every step down the slope was vivid with contrasts the forward life rarely offers. But here is where the thought becomes even more expansive. What if memory did not vanish as the body restored itself, but remained whole even as youth returned? Would not such a condition create beings who began old, tired, but experienced, and ended young but filled with a lifetime's mastery and knowledge? The child at life's conclusion would look outward with fresh eyes but inward with the depth of an elder sage. Such a reversal could transform the meaning of education, of wisdom, of storytelling itself. Instead of young bodies struggling to learn from older mentors, the very youngest would hold the archive of history, passing it back to those moving upward in their own backward arcs. This scenario carries both fascination and unease, for what society could bear to watch its wisest vanish into infancy even as their bodies seemed ready to live again? The biological layers of this vision invite us deeper still. If regeneration pressed forward, diseases that define our later years would dissolve like mist. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cardiovascular breakdowns, cancers, the shadows of age would scatter gradually, not worsening but lightening with each decade. The paradoxical miracle here would be that suffering decreased with time instead of increasing, that the very markers we dread became assurances of healing instead. Imagine the relief of families watching their loved ones grow freer of pain, of hospitals transforming into places of celebration for each successive redistribution of vitality. Yet, inevitably, the horizon still closes, the regression still converges at helpless infancy, meaning that suffering is not erased, only rearranged, shifted toward the beginning instead of the end. The burdens are carried differently but not less heavily. This is where human imagination confronts philosophy, for biology alone cannot resolve what meanings such an inversion would hold. Is life truly better if youth and strength arrive last instead of first? Is wisdom truly valuable if it unravels by necessity, slipping through one's grasp while one's body becomes ever more capable? Perhaps this reversal teaches us something hidden about the nature of time itself, that both directions are equally bound by impermanence. What matters is not whether age progresses or regresses, but whether in either trajectory we can see beauty in its fleeting arc. The Benjamin Button existence, whether mythical or scientific, quietly insists that we cannot escape the fact that endings come disguised as beginnings and beginnings carry the seed of endings within them. And yet let us not forget the emotional richness of imagining such beauty. Picture a young adult who, after years of carrying the weight of responsibility, begins to feel it slip away. Their mind no longer haunted by constant memory, their body freshening each morning, they carry an almost supernatural glow. Friends remark upon how vibrant they have become, how grief seems to fall off them, how joy seems to return with effortless regularity. Over time, their laughter grows freer, their eyes more curious, their movements more nimble. They are not gathering toward an inevitable decay but dispersing into innocence, and though tragedy lies at the end, it does not oppress them. Rather, it invites them to live each day more completely, because each day gifts them renewal instead of decline. In the quiet contemplation of such stories, one begins to feel carried by the rhythm of speculation, not rushing, not forcing, but letting imagination stretch outward like an ocean tide. Is not the idea of living life backward the very essence of dreaming? We drift along its strange currents, reminded of the scientific truths that hint at reversibility, seduced by the philosophical quandaries, soothed by the images of bodies regaining strength rather than losing it. Each paragraph carries us deeper into the unknown, and yet that unknown feels strangely calm, like a path meant not to be solved quickly but savored slowly. The awareness of possibility lingers in the air the way music lingers long after the final note, fading yet resonant, carrying both awe and serenity. As the mind sinks further into this contemplation, it feels almost as though time itself joins the meditation, no longer forward, no longer backward, but suspended in stillness. In that stillness, the complexities of biology and the mysteries of experience harmonize. The human picture is not one of completeness but of multiplicity, a reminder that life is endlessly strange, endlessly open to interpretation. Whether we age forward as our bodies have always done or whether we imagine aging backward as some alternate vision, we are united by the same truth: the journey is fragile, the meaning always precious, the mystery always greater than our explanations. And in surrendering to that recognition, we find ourselves calmed, stilled, and gently carried toward rest. If one allows the mind to drift gently into the full picture of this reversed life, to lay aside resistance and let the imagination fully enter its rhythm, then it becomes possible to glimpse how such an existence might truly unfold, not just in fragments of biology or philosophy, but in the layered texture of daily living. To inhabit a backward life is not only to accept a rearrangement of years, it is to imagine how every moment, every relationship, every sensation would be perceived differently when ordered in reverse. The story does not simply linger on cells rejuvenating or diseases dissolving, but on what it would mean for human beings to forge an entire journey from end to beginning, where survival, identity, growth, and decline are reshaped into their inversions. Birth in this world would not be a joyful announcement of innocence, but a solemn arrival of weariness. Parents would cradle in their arms a newborn shaped by time's weight, a being marked with wrinkles and the frail quiet of age from the very first breath. The cries would not sound playful but fragile, the gaze not wide-eyed with new wonder but calm, even tired, as if carrying echoes of places already traveled. Yet as the months unravel, the paradox reveals itself, strength begins to emerge where weakness was expected, energy slips into the limbs, posture straightens, flesh thickens, and vitality gradually takes hold. The caregivers would watch in astonishment as their child unfurled into vigor, each day not a step away from youth but a step back toward it. The household would be filled with the wonder of seeing life move not toward inevitable decline but toward freshness, and in that wonder would arise new questions. If a child grows younger each day, how does learning unfold? In the conventional flow, a child begins blank and acquires knowledge and skills, slowly layering them across years through experience. But here, perhaps knowledge would be unlearned. The being might begin with an archive of wisdom, already speaking with the nuance and restraint of an elder, and then, over time, words would dissolve, sentences fragment, concepts spill out of reach until eventually language itself vanished into the babbling of youth. The inverted classroom of such a society would be baffling to envision. Teachers would not instill lessons into youthful minds, but attempt to preserve knowledge already present, to record it before it dissipated. Learning would become an act of conservation, not progression, trying to capture forever the insights held in the fading voices of those who steadily edge toward childhood. Such a reversal may pose practical impossibilities, but it also illuminates the fragile beauty of knowledge in any form transient, fleeting, like sand slipping despite grasping hands. Friendship in such a reversed flow would also carry unique shapes. In ordinary life, children find play together and then, across the decades, those friendships deepen, tested by the layers of love and grief that unfold over time. But here, one might begin with friendships steeped in solemn reflection, forged by the gravitas born of apparent age, only to find those bonds transforming into something more playful, more light-hearted, as years pass. Two backwards aging individuals could meet wrinkled and weary, sharing conversations of great depth, speaking as if they had known the complexities of a life already lived. But as time wore on, those same companions would giggle together, chase each other, and collapse into the simplicity of clapping games or laughter over nothing, their bonds progressing toward innocence. Instead of drifting apart through death or distance, they would dissolve into play, only to vanish together into infancy if time allowed. The poetry of such friendships is almost unimaginable, leaving one both comforted and haunted. Consider also how love might be transfigured by this reversal. Romantic attachment is often rooted in growth, in building together a future, in watching hair gray side by side and supporting each other through leaks in the fabric of vitality. But in a backward life, couples might instead begin their bond already marked with the wear of years. They would meet carrying wrinkles and bowed backs, but instead of watching those bodies crumble further, they would watch them flower into renewed strength. They would celebrate anniversaries by marveling at how their gait had quickened, how their eyes sparkled more with each passing year, how fertility and youth nudged closer instead of drifting further away. Yet that joy would be undercut with approaching tragedy. They would know their laughter and intimacy could not extend into elderhood but would instead end earlier, cut off by the approach of helplessness. Children born into such a system would not have parents who grow old beside them but who transition steadily into dependence, leaving offspring as caregivers for parents who shrink again into weakness. How, then, would family bonds be redefined? Perhaps the very notion of parenting would dissolve into cycles of mutual caretaking, where roles shift continuously and boundaries between generations blur into overlapping exchanges of responsibility. Work and society, in such an imagined cycle, would transform deeply. In our world, careers accumulate over years, mentors pass wisdom to novices, reputations build through experience. But in the inverted realm, reputations might begin fully formed, with authority carried in the gravitas of apparent old age, and then vanish, unraveling into youthful inexperience that can no longer maintain skill. How would one measure value in such a system? Perhaps societies would not depend on an individual's linear growth but would instead build archives that capture the words, skills, and visions of their most aged citizens at birth, preserving them before they fade into memory loss and youth. The libraries of such a culture would be filled with the voices of infants who once spoke with elderly eloquence, stored carefully against the erosion that follows. The community would learn always to listen early, to gather the pearls before they were lost, to honor each birth as a fleeting fountain of wisdom evaporating with every passing season. The concept stretches further when one contemplates the clash between biology and emotions. A backward life would grant bodies resilience moving forward into time, but alongside physical strength, maturity of judgment may evaporate. Imagine a young adult, vibrant and strong, chasing vitality with every step, yet increasingly naive with each year, their decisions becoming more reckless, their understanding more limited. Social systems would need to adjust, perhaps governing not on the basis of biological vitality but of psychological depth, privileging earlier years of reversed life when wisdom was most abundant. Might entire civilizations cluster their governance around the counsel of those just recently born, knowing they still carried insight before innocence reclaimed them? The weight of leadership could fall not upon elders in the conventional sense but upon newborns, paradoxically ancient in spirit though only days into existence. Such a transformation of politics would be unimaginable in our world yet curiously coherent in one dominated by reversal. Religion and spirituality, too, would bend under the implications of this reversal. Much of humanity's current spiritual framework rests upon the inevitability of decline, upon the passage from strength into frailty, upon preparation for an afterlife during the years of waning. Rituals of farewell, prayers for long life, hopes for renewal beyond the grave, all of these emerge from the forward trajectory. But in a backward reality, spirituality would grow from the opposite sanctity, the miracle of rebirth experienced not once but gradually, daily, supplanting despair with growth, until final surrender not into wisdom but into the wide-eyed helplessness of babyhood. Would religion celebrate this daily cycle of rejuvenation as proof of divine design? Would they see the regression into childhood not as tragedy but as the ultimate return to purity? Could the infant at deathbed be sanctified not as one diminished, but as one restored fully to innocence, closer to the divine because stripped of experience and ego alike? Such thought offers a haunting beauty that transcends doctrine itself. One cannot help but return to the personal dimension, asking how the backwards life would truly feel to the individual living it. When we live forward, we grow attached to the accumulation of memory, cherishing the fact that we learn more as years expand, that we stand upon the shoulders of our own past. In reversal, however, attachment to knowledge could only end in grief, for each day would lighten the burden of memory until nothing recognizable remained. Imagine the quiet sadness of feeling stories slip through your grasp, of recognizing loved ones in fewer fragments, of realizing that while your body felt better, your mind's continuity was unraveling. Yet sadness might yield slowly into serenity, because as memory dissolved, so too would worry, regret, and fear. The mind would drift into the untroubled space of childhood wonder, where each day was free of burdens, where every sight, every sound could astonish anew, freed of the anchor of responsibility. The backward life may thus grant a strange consolation, that even as identity disassembled, peace flowed in to replace it. From this long meditation, the pattern emerges more clearly. To live backward would not be merely to defy death, nor to achieve eternal youth, but to reorder the experience of human meaning. Strength would arrive not as promise but as culmination. Wisdom would not be the crown of old age but the fleeting blanket of birth. Families would not raise children but gradually care for parents who diminutively drew nearer to infancy. Societies would not grow by accumulating knowledge over decades but by harvesting it early before it slipped away. Religion, politics, intimacy, memory, everything would be reframed by inversion, every expectation erased and rewritten. And still, even in imagining such strangeness, one cannot help but sense the calming flow of the thought. To step into this reversal is to drift along a river where all directions are different yet harmonious, where each reflection reveals hidden truths about the world we already know. Life, whether forward or backward, is still life. The beauty lies not in which way the clock ticks but in the opportunity to live within it, however strange its rhythm. As the mind sits with these speculations, the images weave together into something dreamlike. A face cradled at birth that grows more youthful each year. A society recording the words of newborn elders before they vanish into giggles. Lovers laughing as bodies bloom even as memories fade. Friends ending their stories not in sorrow but in games of play. Families nurturing backward, children guiding adults back into innocence. Each picture arises gently, then drifts away, like fragments of a dream. And so, as the night deepens and the mind continues to wander, the story of backward life curls inward like the closing petals of a flower. Nothing in reality may follow such a pattern, and yet to let the thought take hold is enough to quiet the restlessness of the day. For in the backward journey, as much as in the forward, the truth remains: all arcs lead to fragility, all stories bend into silent conclusion, and all existence is both mysterious and profound. In this realization, imagination itself becomes a cradle, rocking us into calm, and the gentle questioning of what life could be turned softly into acceptance of life as it is. From this acceptance flows peace, and from peace arises rest, and from rest comes the deep quiet where time itself becomes irrelevant, only the stillness of sleep unfolding without direction at all. From the moment we begin to explore this inverted journey, where time folds back on itself and the human story is told in reverse, we inevitably arrive at the most intimate circle of existence, the way family and society would respond if such a reality were true. It is one thing to imagine cells regenerating or memory unraveling, but it is quite another to imagine how human connections, expectations, and traditions would reshape themselves around this pattern. Life does not take place in a vacuum. We are born into families, raised in communities, and surrounded by generations that give meaning to who we are. If backward aging were the fundamental truth of existence, then families would have to reimagine their roles entirely. Society itself would rearrange its rhythms, laws, and understandings, adapting to a cycle completely foreign to the one we know. Think of the moment when parents, eagerly preparing for a birth, are met not with the sight of a rosy-cheeked, helpless infant, but with a being that resembles someone in the twilight of life, wrinkled, fragile, stooped in ways that seem impossible for something newly born. And yet, as days pass, that fragile creature does not weaken further but instead begins to gain strength. The wrinkles smooth, the skin softens, the eyes sparkle with increasing light, strength fills limbs that once seemed frail. In our world, parents look forward with hope to the milestones of growth: the first crawl, the first step, the first words. In the backwards world, however, those milestones occur in reverse order. The being in their arms may speak fluently, may even counsel them like an elder during those earliest days, but with the slow glide of time those fluent words would dwindle into incomplete sentences, into babbling sounds, until speech itself was lost. Parents would not celebrate a toddler's first word, but mourn gently a young adult's final sentences. They would not wait for a first walk but remember with bittersweet tenderness the last graceful step before crawling overtook standing, and crawling gave way to immobility. Parenting in this reverse timeline would carry burdens of a very different kind. In our familiar world, patience is demanded of parents as they guide children through helplessness toward independence. It is a gradual release of responsibility as the child learns to walk on their own, feed themselves, take on more and more control of their destiny. But in the inverted world, parenting would never be a process of letting go. Instead, it would be a deepening responsibility, a knowing that every year would demand more care, not less. To raise a backwards aging child would be to prepare constantly for a return to dependence. Parents would need to look primarily toward the later years, understanding that the playful teenager would not emerge into adulthood, but slip steadily back toward vulnerability, eventually requiring cradling arms once more. Parenting would not end with a child's independence, it would conclude with the solemn finality of regression into infancy. This inversion of roles would expand beyond the immediate family into entire social structures. Consider grandparents, who in our familiar reality serve as the elders imparting wisdom down the family line. In a society governed by reverse aging, grandparents and grandchildren might occupy strangely mirrored places. An older-appearing person, newly born, could carry insights like a grandparent, yet would grow gradually into a state of dependence matching the grandchild in overlapping rhythms. Families might see generations moving toward one another in reverse, elders becoming children again, children aging toward vigor and then reversing, their arcs crossing in bewildering but tender patterns. It could even be possible for a family to experience a reversal where a grandparent and grandchild converge into near-equal physical states, one growing younger, one retaining strength before heading downward as well. Generational identities would become blurred, leaving families to construct connections less on age categories than on present condition, care, and emotional presence. Marriage and romance would also take on entirely new meanings in such a reversed order. In our world, two people meet in youth or early adulthood, build a shared future, accumulate experience side by side, and grow old together until one departs. In the backward life, couples might meet when they both still carry the marks of age, beginning their relationships with bodies that appear brittle or tired. As the years pass, however, they would watch one another bloom into youth. Romance would not be a fire that mellowed gradually into companionship, but a companionship that steadily ignited into youthful fire. Two people might discover passion more intensely as the decades moved, finding themselves with more energy, more vulnerability, more playful desire as time carried them toward youthful bodies. The irony is profound. Relationships would reach peak physical intimacy only as minds slipped out of maturity, reducing lovers into states of innocent play rather than sustained partnership. Families would be built not on shared responsibilities carried into elderhood, but on shared moments of growing delight before regression undid their bonds. The very idea of child-rearing within such partnerships raises further puzzles. If parents emerge as individuals walking backward into youth, their capacity for responsibility would diminish across the years. Children born into such structures would perhaps be cared for by broader networks, entire communities stepping in as parents grew less able. The family unit would be less nuclear, more communal, with groups collectively raising the young and also caring for parents as they dissolved into childhood. Society at large would need to reposition its foundations to ensure no one drifted backward into infancy alone. Care would be both the greatest honor and the greatest burden in this world, stretching across generations not just to protect children but to protect adults as they return to that vulnerable state. The rituals of society would also shift dramatically. Today, we mark birthdays as celebrations of progress, another year older, another step into growth. In the reverse life, birthdays would be a countdown. Each anniversary would not celebrate further movement into maturity but highlight how far one had already receded. Families might gather not with balloons and cakes but with solemn acknowledgement of another piece of wisdom lost, another skill fading away, while simultaneously cherishing the restoration of youth in the body. Milestones might invert themselves. Instead of celebrating the first driving of a car, societies might commemorate the last time someone drove before innocence returned. Instead of remembering retirement as a time of rest, they might hold ceremonies for the moment someone's expanding vitality freed them from disease or frailty before youth carried away their authority. Governance itself would not escape transformation. Laws are built around assumptions of maturity, accountability, and decline. Our own societies grant voting rights after years of growth, retire citizens at elder ages, and entrust decision-making to those who accumulate knowledge across decades. In the reverse life, social order may privilege newborns as the wisest among them, those still carrying memory intact. The ones arriving at birth, their spirits wrapped in apparent age, may be seen as sages, their voices preserved before they slipped out of coherence. As time passed, power would fall away from them, redistributed gradually to younger bodies whose minds no longer commanded complexity. Imagine a parliament filled with infants who carried vast wisdom only days after birth, whose contributions set policies before their words dissolved into stammers. History books would be compiled from their fleeting insights, nations guided by their counsel preserved in written or recorded form. The very foundation of authority would tilt onto its head, treating what we call the beginning as simultaneously an end. Cultural traditions would, in turn, train themselves to honor these reversals. Weddings, funerals, festivals, all would carry new undertones. A funeral, for example, would not mark the departure of someone aged by decades of growth, but the passing of someone who had shrunk into babyhood, their cries faint echoes before silence. Communities might gather to honor not the aged face but the innocence of the being departed, remembering the dignity of their first elder days at birth while mourning the fragile purity at their end. Weddings might be seen as promises not to grow old together but to grow young together, to laugh playfully before innocence unraveled them. Festivals of community would celebrate the moment families welcomed backward-aged newborns, gathering quickly to preserve their wisdom before it melted away. Everything we know about continuity and memory would invert itself into a culture trained not on growth, but on preservation against unlearning. Education, too, becomes a universe of paradox. Instead of teaching blank slates, systems would focus urgently on documenting and archiving the knowledge that individuals begin with. Schools might exist not to fill minds but to capture the fleeting sparks of wisdom still present in backward-aging children at their early years. Entire academies may be devoted to interviewing newborns, carefully transcribing their insights, philosophies, and memories before time dissolved them into simplicity. Libraries would not expand with accumulated knowledge but would function as vaults of fading memory, each generation rushing to preserve the dwindling legacies of those sliding into youth. A professor of great repute might need to publish as soon as possible because every year thereafter their grasp of complexity would decrease. Children, instead of learning multiplication, would gradually forget it, the curriculum designed to sustain their skills for as long as possible before retreat was inevitable. Education becomes an act of containment rather than discovery, mirroring the rhythm of life itself. This way of life would surely shape emotional expectations as well. In our age, parents often dream of the achievements their children will someday reach, the careers, the families, the legacies they will build. In a backward world, those dreams would be reversed. Parents would not hope for future achievements but would remember them, if achievements existed at the beginning of life. The pride of a child's success would be described in past tense, known and treasured the moment they were born, savored in memory before it disappeared. Instead of urging children forward, parents would guard fiercely against the fading of what was already known. Pride and joy would orbit around preservation, memory as the most beloved of treasures. Every smile, every tender moment, every word of advice given by a newborn sage would be held close, knowing its permanence was impossible. Society, at every level, would orient itself toward caretaking as its highest principle. Hospitals would not only care for the fragile elderly but for all who are inevitably regressing. Communities would require vast networks of caregivers, not only for children beginning their journey but for adults moving steadily toward helplessness. Technology might evolve not to extend life, but to cushion the regression, to provide dignity as independence dissolved. Robots, caretakers, entire infrastructures devoted to ensuring that those who once walked strong could find peace while crawling again. It is easy to see how compassion would become the cornerstone of survival in such a reality. The preservation of dignity, the kindness of presence, the patience of care, these would surpass ambition, power, or productivity as society's core values. Amidst such imaginings, one returns always to the human heart. How would it feel to love someone who is constantly disappearing from you, not through sudden death but through gradual withdrawal into innocence? How would it feel to meet someone full of wisdom, only to watch that wisdom scatter like leaves each year? How would it feel to hold a partner's hand knowing that their strength was growing even as their insight dissolved? And how would society learn to cherish not only the arrival of a being but the daily losses carried forward? Love, in such a world, must take a different form. It must be resilient not because it grows, but because it learns to let go gently, to celebrate what is left while accepting the constant flow of what is fading. And in contemplating this, one finds themselves carried into a peculiar calm, noticing how this reversal draws attention to what already exists in our world. For even though we age forward, we still endure loss of strength, of memory, of presence. We still require compassion, caretaking, patience, and love. The backward thought experiment simply makes these realities sharper, more vivid, as though turning a mirror upon the truths we already know. Families must always say goodbye bit by bit. Society must always learn to support its vulnerable. Love is always an act of preserving what fades. As the mind drifts with this thought, images form softly and dissolve again. A family circled around a newborn elder, listening in reverent silence. A community transcribing the words of a child who speaks like a philosopher. Lovers laughing more and more as their bodies rejuvenate, innocence cresting again before silence falls. Citizens crowded quietly to record the stories of those who have only just arrived. Rituals of memory, rituals of loss, rituals of celebration woven together like threads in backward time. The more one imagines it, the more one realizes that whether forward or backward, the essence of human life is shared, fragile in beginning, fragile in ending, strong in between, invaluable in every fleeting detail. The backward life may rearrange the pieces, but it cannot erase the tenderness, the grief, the joy, the love that mark the human journey. Those remain constant, anchored even when time itself runs against its own arrow. And in resting with that, the mind sinks into serenity, knowing that whichever way the clock turns, existence remains precious, and the act of imagining reveals truths more timeless than any direction. Through this reflection, the heart is softened, the restlessness soothed. Time, forward or backward, loosens its hold as thought flows like water, circling, reversing, finding calm in the ebbing tide. The story is not sharp, it does not end abruptly. It folds into silence, letting the imagination cradle itself, letting the mystery rock gently, until the listener drifts closer and closer into sleep. If one continues this slow and deep movement through the imagined reality of reverse aging, the path inevitably winds into questions of medicine and healing. It is impossible to picture a humanity living in this inverted cycle without also picturing how doctors, healers, and entire systems of care would transform once the natural trajectory of the body is rewritten. In our familiar unfolding of life, medicine fights against decline, guards against the assaults of disease, seeks to prolong vitality even as inevitability gathers. But in a reversed existence, the very canvas of medicine would be rearranged, and with it the role of doctors, treatments, hospitals, and entire philosophies of care. What we know of illness, of recovery, of vulnerability would be reversed, turned upside down, and reshaped into a landscape both haunting and strangely promising. The newborn, in such a world, would not cry out with the fragile vigor of a helpless infant but instead enter as though life had already been lived. Imagine the delivery room not as a place of a beginning body still untouched by time, but as a place where parents hold in their arms a being with veins already visible, skin marked with age, hair perhaps turned gray or white. This being would gasp for breath as though weakened by years, not newly adjusting to air. Traditionally, medical professionals rush to ensure the survival of the fragile infant, knowing that the body ahead will grow stronger with time, but here their tasks would be altogether different. They would need to manage conditions we associate with the elderly, heart murmurs, brittle bones, arthritic joints that paradoxically appear at birth. The pediatric E&S role would overlap with that of a geriatrician, for the tools of medicine at the start of life would be those of ending. Birth would be medicalized not to guard against vulnerability of growth but vulnerability of decline that must now be reversed. Yet as weeks, months, and years passed, the need for these interventions would lessen as strength renewed itself naturally. Where our current medicine constantly fears disease's progression, backward life would make disease itself temporary. Think of cancer, often seen as a mutation that blooms in late years, accumulating with time. In a reversed pattern, cancers would be present first, perhaps even seen as congenital at birth, yet would dissolve predictably as the body's cellular clock wound back, mutations unraveling, tissues purifying themselves. A doctor would tell anxious parents not that the malignancy was deadly, but that it was temporary, fading year by year. Stroke, dementia, osteoporosis, these two would arrive first, only then to diminish gradually, to leave the being free, unburdened by conditions that had seemed terminal. Hospitals might become places of early vigilance, where fragile newborn elders receive care until the inexorable healing of reverse time overtakes their frailty. By adolescence, not only would vitality be restored, but an entire horizon of health would spread ahead. The physician's challenge would not be to prolong strength but to guide it safely into its peak before regression into helpless infancy arrived again. Imagine the transformation for mental health professionals. In our reality, therapists, counselors, and caregivers often confront the sorrow of decline, the dementia patient losing words, the Alzheimer's patient forgetting faces, the confusion of deteriorating cognition. In an inverted life, these phenomena would occur not at the end but at the beginning. Parents would endure the heartbreak of watching their newborn elders speak fluently, tell detailed stories, share wisdom, only for those capacities to fade over the years. Psychiatry would be a practice of recording and preserving the insight of the beginning rather than trying to restore it at the end. Libraries of memory would be built from the earliest years, not the later years, because therapists would know that everything truly remarkable in consciousness was destined to slip away as youth advanced. The therapeutic relationship itself would invert, as clinicians comforted not those fearing their end, but those watching helplessly as coherence dripped slowly out of their grasp. Families might attend therapy together when a reversed aging child began forgetting words, not because life was too long, but because innocence was too close. The structure of hospitals would also be redesigned. Currently, pediatric wings are places for children with congenital issues, trauma, or disease, while geriatric wings are reserved for the frailty of elderhood. In a backward society, pediatrics and geriatrics are no longer separate but merged, since infancy and elderhood are one and the same. Hospitals might design entire birth wards that looked like nursing homes, cribs might resemble beds for frail bodies, doctors might walk softly as one tends to fragile elderly patients. Medical students would be trained to treat arthritis before they learn to treat colic, to guard against osteoporosis before teaching parents how to manage teething. Even neonatal intensive care would transform, with machines designed not for tiny lungs but for worn ones, not tubes for nourishment to grow into maturity but therapies to extend strength until the body naturally heals by rewinding. Even more astonishing is the fate of chronic illnesses. In our world, conditions like diabetes, pulmonary disease, chronic heart failure tether people to constant medical interventions. These illnesses worsen with time, requiring vigilant management. In the backward world, however, these diseases would be markers of an early life that gradually smooths. A family doctor would not instruct lifelong changes but reassure patients that, with each passing year, symptoms would fade naturally as youth approached. What is pharmacology in such a place, then? Medicines may be needed most at the start, before gradually reducing, until midlife health is nearly perfect, requiring few interventions at all. Doctors would become guardians of birth and childhood, not of adulthood, because the adult mind in its strength would need hardly any medicine at all. It would be the strange reversal of our present pattern, where society spends vast resources on the medicine of later years. Here, the beginnings would dominate medical spending, and the middle years might be entirely liberated. And yet, this vision is not without complication. Consider pregnancy in a reversed-aged society. If adults grow backward, could reproductive systems endure the same inversions? Would fertility appear not in young adulthood but near the middle point of life, just before the body entered maturity's apex of youth? Obstetric medicine would change entirely, perhaps with parents growing more and more fertile as decades progressed rather than in early adulthood. Imagine societies where birth rates peak not with youth but with maturity retreating toward adolescence. Doctors in obstetrics would face the challenge of helping mothers whose psychology was already reversing, perhaps youthful in spirit, even playful, while the body grew fertile and strong. Parents would give birth while heading toward innocence at the same time, creating paradox after paradox for medicine and family alike. Public health systems, too, would need complete restructuring. Vaccinations, for example, are timed in childhood to prepare immune systems against disease. But in a backward unfolding, immune systems would actually improve with time, not weaken. Should vaccines be administered at birth when bodies are frail, even though strength increases naturally? Or would children acquire an immune memory early only to lose it while growing backward? Disease control would become a dance of constant management, ensuring that the unlearning of immunity did not leave communities unprotected. Physicians might race to transfer knowledge of immunity into artificial archives, reinfusing the body with immunological memory as it faded away, sustaining wellness even as nature erased defenses with each step toward childhood. Ethics of medicine loom heavily in this contemplation. In our world, ethical dilemmas often surround prolonging life artificially, using machines to extend breath when natural function has ceased. In backward life, the target of intervention would not be delaying death but cushioning regression. Would society invest in technologies that sustained memory longer, that kept adults wiser even as the natural clock dictated unlearning? Or would such efforts be seen as cruel interferences with a natural design? Doctors, philosophers, and spiritual leaders would clash over these boundaries. Some would argue for preserving every ounce of early wisdom before childhood claimed it. Others would argue for surrendering, letting the flow of reversal follow its tranquil path into innocence. Entire schools of medical ethics would form around the question of whether it is more merciful to hold memory as long as possible or to allow forgetfulness to soften the passage into peace. The economics of healthcare changes equally. Today, nations struggle with the overwhelming costs of treating age-related diseases as populations live longer. Reversed age would shift those burdens to the earliest stages of life. Hospitals might be busiest with newborns, caring for arthritis, cancers, emphysema, and dementia, every ailment familiar to old age, condensed into the beginning. As those beings move downward toward strength, the cost plummets. Adults need fewer treatments, fewer interventions, until adolescence and youth require little but emotional or social support. Economies might devote most of their medical technology not to prolonging a life at its end but to sustaining one at its start, ensuring that families endure the fragile years until vitality overtakes fragility naturally. Insurance systems, policies, entire networks of care would be built for this early burden, leaving the later decades almost untouched by medicine. It is a sobering paradox. Healthcare would pour its efforts not toward extending lives but toward sustaining lives until nature itself restored them. There is also a fascinating paradox in the psychological role of medicine in this reversed arc. In our life, people visit doctors with anxiety about decline, fear of aging skin, fear of thinning bones, fear of weakened minds. Medicine becomes synonymous with prevention, with delay, with staving off the inevitable. In the backward life, patients might instead go to doctors with relief, being reassured that their weakness is temporary, that their feeble arms will grow stronger, their breath fuller, that each passing year gifts them renewal. Doctors would become interpreters of hope rather than defenders against despair. Clinics might be filled with families smiling through treatments, buoyed by the certainty that health improves naturally, simply by being alive day after day. The role of positive psychology, of comfort, of guidance would become central to practicing physicians, as every visit is less a warning and more a promise: tomorrow you will be stronger than today. Through all of this, the wider impression is profound. Medicine in such a backward reality would not merely treat disease differently, it would embody a culture shifted entirely in its relationship to life and time. Frailty would no longer be the destiny of existence but its beginning. Healing would not be occasional but constant, woven into the very march of years. Hospitals would not be places of resistance against the end, but sanctuaries of patience until the natural inversion of age restored wellness. Doctors would be not only healers but archivists, recording the wisdom that patients were losing even as their bodies recovered. Families would not dread aging but cherish it, for to age in that world is to become younger, stronger, freer. It is a paradox that medicine both heals and preserves, both comforts and remembers, both accepts and resists, woven together in ways we can only dream of. To sink into this thought is to feel drawn deeper into awe. In envisioning a medical world built for people aging backwards, we see more than just science. We see the dreams of humanity, the longing to undo pain, the desire for perpetual youth, the craving for dignity from beginning to end. Even if such a reality is only imagination, it allows us to rest gently with a truth that reaches further, that the work of medicine in any world is not simply to resist biology, but to honor life in whatever direction it flows. Whether battling decline or cushioning regression, whether preserving memory or celebrating innocence, the physician's task mirrors the sacred task of life itself to recognize fragility and respond with care. And with that recognition comes calm. Imagining hospitals where newborn elders gradually unfurl into childhood again, imagining doctors recording fragments of wisdom before they fade, imagining parents who cradle age before it dissolves into laughter, all of this leaves not only questions, but peace. For what remains clear, through forward time or backward, is that the human journey deserves tending, deserves gentleness, deserves reverence. In picturing medicine caring for a backward humanity, we are reminded of what it already means to care for humanity as it is. And in that remembrance, the heart loosens, accepting the mysteries of time, surrendering to the quiet rhythm of existence, and floating easily into rest. The more one allows this journey to unfold in the imagination, the more the question of meaning rises to the surface, as though gently carried there by the tide of thought. If life itself were truly lived in reverse, then beyond biology, beyond medicine, beyond society, there is the deeper question of philosophy, of the way such a reality would shape our ideas of time, purpose, memory, identity, and ultimately the meaning of being alive. For what else could such a reversal demand of us but to rethink not only how people live but why they live at all? In the world we know, philosophy has always leaned upon the arrow of time as a foundational principle. Ancient thinkers framed human destiny in terms of growth, maturity, decline, and death. Religions arose anchored in the reality of forward-aging promises of eternal youth, visions of afterlives free from deterioration, stories of rebirth that return innocence forever. We intuitively anchor hope in the idea of progress, that as bodies decline, perhaps souls progress, that as minds fade, spirits ascend. If the human arc were reversed, philosophy itself would be rippled by its inversion, forcing all traditions to view existence not as a story of becoming but a story of undoing. One might begin by asking how memory defines identity. In our forward-lived lives, identity is cumulative. From infancy upward, a person gathers reminders of selfhood, names called lovingly, lessons learned by trial and error, memories stitched together as proof that I persists across time. Death, though frightening, at least comes at the end of continuity, with all the collected shards of identity intact. But in reverse life, identity would not be built but dissolved. The newborn elder might carry a treasury of memories, bound tight with wisdom. Yet each passing year those memories would erode, piece by piece, until by adolescence almost nothing remained. Would such a being feel robbed of their essence, or would they feel freed from the weight of the self, loose to float joyfully into childlike innocence? That is a staggering philosophical shift, to see not the building of self as meaning, but the losing of self as liberation. This liberation can be seen as terrifying or transcendent depending on how one looks at the direction of the journey. In our own reality, we mourn dementia and the fading of memory at the end of life, for it tears away bonds that took years to create. A reversed existence reframes this erosion as destiny, not as tragedy. The gradual surrender of memory becomes not a cruel theft, but the path all must walk. What seems horror to us to lose the narrative of oneself might be venerated in such a society as a holy return to simplicity. Innocence would be destiny. A philosopher in this world might argue that purity, not wisdom, is the perfection of humankind. They might say that all journeys are successful only if they reach the state of unknowing, where experience falls away like petals, revealing the untouched bud at the center. Yet still, another might protest. For what is life without continuity? If identity dissolves, is there really a person living, or is there merely a string of vanishing impressions? The mind might cling desperately to the value of memory even in reverse, keeping journals, recordings, archives, desperate to defy the backward drift. Imagine libraries of voices, not of elders approaching the end, but of newborns full of wisdom, whose every word was written down before innocence swallowed it. Philosophy would wrestle with this question for centuries: is the true human essence to strip away until only wonder is left, or to hold desperately to knowledge and continuity against the flow? In such a world, thinkers would gather in forums not to debate the growth of reason, but to debate its inevitable unmaking. Some would say surrender is peace. Others would say preservation is dignity. Both would argue from the same truth that time carries everything away, only in inverted sequence. Another question rises from the nature of beginnings and endings themselves. In our world, life begins fragile and ends fragile, but we think of the start as full of potential and the end as closure. The story forms a line. But when life is lived in reversal, beginnings and endings begin to blur. Birth becomes strange, containing not innocence but conclusion, while death contains not wounds of old age, but the wail of new life. What, then, does ending mean? If one's last breath is with the body of an infant, does that feel like arrival rather than departure? Perhaps in such a culture, philosophers would abolish the word end altogether, preferring cycles, currents, the soft folding of one into another. The linearity of meaning would not survive here. Neither beginning nor end would be stable points, but illusions of perspective, masks worn by the same act of passage. Religious traditions would absorb this inversion into their cosmologies as well. Theologies would emerge that spoke not of sin accumulated and then absolved, but of wisdom accumulated and then surrendered. A human soul, lived backwards, might be seen as proof that purity is ultimate, that every being is destined not to fall away from paradise but to fall into it. In sacred texts, the baby at death's door would not be mourned as weak, but venerated as sacred, closest to the divine because it has been fully stripped of experience, ego, and ambition. Faith communities in such a reality might gather not to celebrate the growth of knowledge but to practice the art of forgetting, of loosening the grip of identity and resting in the innocence that awaits all. To die in babyhood would not be despair, but the final gift of return. The very fabric of ethics would shift. In our culture, ethical frameworks are often built upon the responsibilities that increase with age, the expectation of maturity, accountability, the growing burden of care one provides to younger generations. But in the reversed arc, responsibility diminishes as time passes. What does it mean to live ethically when one cannot maintain those responsibilities forever, when regression into innocence is as natural as growth is for us? Entire philosophical systems may rise teaching the dignity of surrender, the morality of letting go. Parents would not prepare children for independence, but children would prepare parents for dependence. Families would discuss not how to instill resilience but how gently to support dissolution. To be moral in this world might be defined not by what is created but by how compassionately one accompanies another back into simplicity. This brings us to the question of meaning itself. In our timeline, we often define life's purpose through growth, accomplishments, the creation of legacies. We find meaning in leaving something behind: a family raised, a work completed, lessons offered. But what is meaning in reverse? When accomplishments are known at the start and then forgotten? When a being may begin with insight and progressively lose it? Perhaps meaning would detach itself from permanence altogether and shift into the practice of presence. Meaning would no longer be defined as what remains, but what exists, fleeting and delicate. To carry wisdom for a year before it melts into babbling would not be failure. In such a culture it would be celebrated, like the flowering of a rare bloom. Ephemeral existence would be seen not as weakness but as truth. Philosophers might say, the meaning of life is not to build, but to dissolve gracefully, like water flowing back into the sea. There is also the haunting beauty of thinking that all of this reveals much about our current forward-moving condition. When we imagine identity being lost deliberately in reverse, we see reflected in sharper ways what already happens in our real world through aging. We see that memory already fades. We see that innocence already returns at the edges of life. We see dependence already bookending our existence. The Benjamin Button reality does not so much create opposites as it throws light upon the hidden symmetries. By imagining philosophy reversing itself, we realize the truths that are common either way, that life is fragile, meaning is fleeting, love is necessary, compassion is sacred. From here the imagination lingers on how individuals in such reversed cultures might sit quietly by firelight, discussing not how to become better, but how to let go more beautifully. Elders, ironically newborns, would share their insights of long lives already remembered, while their families would nod, knowing those words would soon fade and be replaced by laughter stripped of complexity. Communities would hold rituals of remembering, inscribing wisdom into culture before it was lost. The practice of philosophy would not be the building of doctrines but the recording of fragments, notebooks filled with the sayings of newborns, treasured scrolls of first words that were also last wisdoms. Temples may be filled not with icons of elders revered for their late-life teachings, but with cradles carved in gold, celebrating the holiness of beings who arrived already ancient in spirit. The paradox of time itself would dominate thinking. Some philosophers would argue that reverse aging is proof of the illusion of linearity, that time is merely perception, that beginnings and endings are arbitrary points we invent. Others would insist that time itself is the core of identity, whether moving forward or backward, that it is precisely in the movement through change that consciousness arises. To live backward, they would say, is just as authentic as to live forward, because reality is always transition, never fixed, always dissolving. Thinkers in such societies might meditate on the sound of rivers flowing, some listening one way, some imagining the waves in reverse, yet recognizing that either way the water moves. The conclusion might be a serenity that transcends debate, that whatever path time takes, it carries us where we must go. To dwell in this contemplation is to feel a profound quiet take hold. The backwards life reshapes not only philosophy but how one approaches rest, for the very act of imagining it is a kind of surrender. It eases the anxieties of control by showing that whether one builds up or unravels, the end is the same, dissolution into something beyond. It teaches that life itself, however oriented, is always transition, always impermanent, always precious for its fleeting quality. And so the listener, drifting with these reflections, no longer hungers for answers but is lulled gently by the questions themselves. It becomes less important to resolve the paradoxes and more important simply to sit among them, allowing mind and spirit to float in their calm waters. And as these waters flow, sleep itself comes closer. The voice of philosophy does not demand urgency but invites release. The backward journey, though strange, glimmers with familiarity. It tells us that innocence waits at the end, that selfhood itself will dissolve, that compassion must guide us in all directions. To let these thoughts carry you now is to yield to the texture of time without resistance, to surrender to stillness, to accept that whether forward or backward, meaning lies in the capacity to love and to rest. And so, little by little, thought slows, the rhythm softens, and what was once reflection folds naturally into dreaming. When the thread of imagination pulls us further into this backward unfolding of human existence, the vision begins to stretch beyond individuals, families, and medicine, expanding into the scope of entire cultures and societies. It is not enough to contemplate how one life is lived differently when time runs in reverse. The larger question is how communities of people, entire generations living side by side, would build institutions, histories, laws, and cultures from such a foundation. In our ordinary world, collective life is organized around predictable arcs: education in childhood, work in midlife, wisdom in elderhood, succession at death. But in a society where all of these stages are inverted, culture itself becomes a mirror image, repeating familiar structures only to twist them into unfamiliar forms that shake our understandings of progress, history, and continuity. From the very beginning, history would read differently. In our societies, the heroes of history are remembered for what they built over time: leaders whose decisions guided nations, artists whose works matured with their skill, thinkers whose insights grew sharper in elder years. In the reversed reality, figures of history would be commemorated less for what they built slowly and more for the fleeting brilliance they exhibited at life's beginning. A newborn who arrived brimming with wisdom might leave behind journals, dictations, or teachings before those words evaporated from their consciousness. Societies would scramble to record them, and generations might treat those early records as sacred, for they contained the last remnants of wisdom before the backward current swept it away. Entire libraries might be built upon the sayings of infants who entered the world speaking like sages, entire philosophies born not from the studies of growing adults, but from the syllables of newborn voices. Education as an institution would similarly reshape itself, binding itself not to preparation for adulthood but to preservation of what was already known. Schools in such cultures would not focus on long curriculums that expand year after year but would center on capturing knowledge before it disappears. Children born wise would be placed into halls of scribes, their lectures recorded, their philosophies preserved. Gradually, as their comprehension faded, they would be allowed into classrooms not to learn new material but to maintain what dwindled, sustaining math, language, or reasoning skills as long as possible before innocence replaced them completely. Teachers might spend their careers trying to hold intelligence steady against the current of time, until eventually their students wandered out into a simpler, freer life with no memory at all. Communities might even hold ceremonies when words were lost, gentle gatherings that honored not failure, but the natural rhythm of forgetting. Education in such a society would not be about climbing a mountain but about collecting flowers on a slope before they float away on the wind. Work and economy would also demand reinvention. In our societies, careers and labor are structured to harness the energy of adulthood, with training in youth, productivity in maturity, and retirement in old age. With backward lives, labor would reverse its anchor points. The earliest years after birth would be the most knowledgeable and wise for individuals, yet their bodies would be fragile. The middle span of life would offer the strongest bodies, but not the deepest understanding, since memory and wisdom would be slowly washing away. Entire economies might come to rest on collaborations between the very young and the very strong, the infants who spoke as sages and the midlife citizens who carried youthful vigor. Together they would form partnerships, the newborns offering counsel, theories, and vision, while the vibrant bodies of younger appearing adults provided labor, carrying out the instructions. Workforces, therefore, would always require interdependence, a balance between fragile wisdom and vigorous vitality. Productivity would not peak at seniority but at the intersection between strength and shrinking knowledge, requiring teammates across ages to complement one another. This would lead to unusual structures of leadership as well. Political systems in such realities would probably lean heavily on the earliest years of life, recognizing the newborns and children as those carrying wisdom that will soon disappear. Councils might assemble immediately upon births, not to celebrate simple life but to capture directives from individuals still anchored in memory. Prophets and leaders might exist not at the close of long lives but at the very dawn, when their voices still held the echoes of the years they were already leaving behind. Citizens would gather reverently to hear the declarations of infants who spoke like ancients, recording their visions before they were lost. After those precious first years, leadership would transition smoothly to bureaucracies trained to interpret this preserved wisdom, working to enact it as the people themselves lost the capacity for intricate governing. Laws, constitutions, and philosophies would therefore always carry the flavor of insight given at the beginning, anchored in the fleeting clarity of newborn sages. Cultural traditions would adapt in thousands of subtle ways. Think of celebrations and holidays, often tied to progress in our world. A birthday is a commemoration that one is older, wiser, closer to maturity. In backward societies, birthdays might be commemorated with quiet respect, not because the person is growing into responsibility but because they are losing a piece of it. The first birthdays would be solemn occasions where wisdom still lingered, everyone listening to capture words before they faded. Later birthdays, however, would be more festive, celebrating innocence and vitality rising, full of games and laughter, marking the liberation from burdens of knowledge. Public rituals would therefore unfold not in linear progression toward achievement but in spirals of preservation, celebration, and gentle mourning of what had been lost. Art and music, too, would carry the imprint of this inversion. Artists would create their masterpieces not at the end of long experimentation but at the start, pouring into the world their inherited vision before their capacities dissolved. A baby might scrawl a painting with the hand of a trembling elder that resonated for centuries, or speak verses of poetry impossible to replicate. Art museums would be filled not with the mature evolution of a single artist across decades, but with singular works captured in infancy, preserved before creativity dissolved. Musicians might record profound symphonies at birth, handed down by scribes, leaving only playful tunes as adulthood set in. Culture would treasure these early expressions with unrivaled reverence, seeing in them the distilled wisdom of whole lives compressed into the first years. Later art, all bright and playful, would be valued too, but as innocence, as reminders of the joy that emerges when complexity fades. Language and traditions of storytelling would also shift dramatically. Myths might retell the journeys of infants who once carried the voice of nations. Proverbs might originate from first words rather than last ones. Elders in societies like ours are seen as keepers of tradition, storytellers who pass along cultural continuity. In reverse societies, the keepers of tradition would always be the youngest, those just born who still remembered the arc. Storytelling circles would be held not at the bedsides of elders but at cradles, communities gathering around to hear wisdom before it slipped away. Oral traditions would be frantic at times, a race against the clock of regression, giving human culture a sense of urgency not to lose, not to forget, not to let wisdom vanish before it could be stored. Whole industries and rituals of memory would grow around the act of recording, archiving, and preserving the voices of the very young. Religion, which reflects the pulse of life itself, would construct its theology in strikingly different forms. In our world, religions comfort people against the decline at the end, encouraging hope for renewal after death. In reverse societies, religions might assure followers not that heaven redeems decline, but that innocence is sacred, that the regression into simplicity is the truest salvation. Shrines could be dedicated not to elder sages but to babies who spoke beautiful truths before innocence silenced them. Priests and spiritual figures may take vows to record and interpret these voices, turning them into holy canon. Temples might hold sacred ceremonies not at the moment of death but at the moment of being first lost the ability to speak in sentences, marking it as the sacred threshold of purity regained. Faith would honor the erasure of experience as the divine journey home, not its accumulation. History itself would be written as fragments stitched together hurriedly. Nations would remember their great leaders not as figures who guided them into matured wisdom over lifetimes, but as newborns whose words were preserved like scripture. Philosophy would be less a matter of dialogue across decades than a vast network of notes, scattered and pieced together by later generations. The chronicle of humanity in such a reality would always carry gaps and silences, because memory is always slipping away through individuals. Only the collective act of preservation would hold history intact. Societies would perhaps place enormous reverence on archivists, scribes, and record keepers, seeing them as guardians of memory nearly as critical as caregivers. To lose records would be to lose entire ages, whole civilizations evaporating like dew. This collective obsession with memory would shape technology as well. While our societies invent machines to extend life and fight disease, backward societies would invent machines to preserve memory and wisdom. Devices to capture every spoken word, every gesture, every insight at birth would be considered indispensable. Perhaps mechanical nurses would record lullabies from newborns who sang them in ancient tones. Technologies might even emerge to try to infuse back lost memories later, plugging gaps in consciousness as a body receded into adolescence. Science in such societies would not be about conquering death but about anchoring memory against the inevitable drift. Libraries might not be vast buildings but entire living archives, communities devoted to storing the wisdom of each generation's youngest citizens. One must also imagine how conflict and war would be shaped by this structure. In our societies, war is waged by the strong energy of youth under the leadership of the wisdom of elders. In reverse societies, war might invert these dynamics. The youngest, at birth, carry wisdom but not strength. The middle-aged hold the strength but not memory. Wars would thus be fragmented, unstable, perhaps rare, for strength without wisdom rarely sustains itself. Armies might need to consult newborn generals for strategy while relying on adolescent-like men and women for strength. But as those generals lost their words, warfare itself might dissolve, leaving peace as the default state. After all, youth without memory carries no grudges. Innocence erases reasons for conflict. Societies aging backwards might therefore lean more naturally toward peace, simply because complexity melts away faster than hostility can sustain itself. The cycle of civilization itself might become more circular, more fragile. In our history, knowledge builds cumulatively across generations, giving rise to technological and cultural progression. A backward humanity, however, faces the constant threat of regression intellectually and socially. Civilizations might rise upon the wisdom of one generation's newborns, only to risk collapse as that wisdom evaporated, requiring careful archival to prevent loss. Progress may happen in leaps rather than steady climbs, bursts of brilliance written down before fading into long stretches of simplicity. Human history would feel less like a straight ascent and more like waves against the shore, ever eroding, ever renewed with each cycle. Cultures might see time itself as waves, not arrows, building and receding in endless motion. And yet, in all of this backwardness, one sees hints of tranquility. For while progress may be fragile, innocence would be abundant. Societies would overflow with joy as laughter, play, and simplicity filled their later years. Communities would be warm with compassion, as caregiving was never distant, always a constant shared responsibility. Division between generations would blur, replaced by shared experiences of dependence in both directions. Traditions would anchor themselves not in ambition but in cherishing fleeting beauty. Cultures might become softer, kinder, shaped by constant awareness of the fragility of memory and the inevitability of return to innocence. As one contemplates this reality, drifting more deeply into its flows, there is a realization, whether forward or backward, culture reflects what we cannot control: the currents of time. Our imagined backward societies do not truly replace ours, they reveal truths about our own. They remind us that memory is fleeting, that culture must always work to preserve its wisdom, that innocence and joy are as valuable as accomplishment, and that compassion is the only thread binding all generations together. In seeing how inverted cultures would shape themselves, we gain insight into our own societies, how fragile and beautiful they always were, even without the reversal. And so, as the thought grows softer, quieter, it begins to settle into restfulness. The vision of archivists scribbling down infant wisdom, of celebrations for innocence, of communities dreaming together under the weight of vanishing memory, drifts like smoke through the imagination. Nothing needs conclusion, for in a backward world nothing truly ends, it only returns to simplicity. The listener can almost feel that simplicity now, as thought untangles, as complexity falls away. One need not solve these mysteries, only cradle them gently like fragments of dream, and let the current of reflection carry one into stillness. As time flows forward or backward or simply holds itself still, the mind, at last, is free to surrender, to drift upon the tide, and to sink into the quiet embrace of sleep. As the vision of reversed humanity flows ever onward, as we drift from families to societies and into cultures reshaped by the inversion of time, the mind begins to expand beyond man-made structures altogether. For to truly rest within this idea, one must look outward into nature, into the greater world of living beings, and ask whether such a reversal is exclusively human fantasy, or whether nature itself has, in its deep silence, already written versions of this story into its living codes. The question arises naturally, if humans in our imagination could age backward, are there not echoes of this possibility hidden in the living creatures with which we inhabit this earth? And if such echoes exist, what do they reveal about the direction of life, about time, about an existence that does not obey the linear arrow we so often take for granted? The biological theatre of Earth has already offered hints of strange reversals, small windows through which we glimpse possibilities of renewal where there should only be decay. Consider the jellyfish, one of the strangest and most ancient beings the oceans have carried across millions of years. Most species, fragile and delicate, move through their cycles much as other creatures do, born, feeding, reproducing, waning, and then passing away. Yet within the deep mystery of the sea exists Turritopsis dohrnii, sometimes nicknamed the immortal jellyfish. Unlike others, this jellyfish does not simply age forward until its tissues succumb. When threatened, it retreats backwards in development, restoring itself from an adult medusa to a polyp, effectively returning to an earlier stage of its existence. Though it does not live forever uninterrupted, it carries within it the astounding gift of directionless life, the ability to begin again. It does not accept time's arrow entirely. In its genome lies a glimpse of what humanity has long dreamed, a collapse of the divide between beginning and end. Other organisms too offer whispers of this possibility. The planarian flatworm, sliced in two, does not simply expire but regenerates both halves, carrying memory forward through unfamiliar tissues. Its stem cells are so abundant, so capable of renewal, that aging seems almost irrelevant to it. Hydras, another seemingly simple aquatic creature, cycle through life without clear evidence of aging at all. Lobsters are curious as well. In many species, they do not weaken with age but grow larger, stronger, producing eggs and sustaining vigor until circumstances such as predation or accidents intervene. Nature does not always progress gently toward frailty, sometimes it bends back into vitality, sometimes it twists the definitions of aging so thoroughly that even science pauses to wonder if immortality in fragments has already been achieved in these forms. Even within human biology, glimpses of this reversal gleam quietly, as though hinting that our dreams are not entirely apart from reality. Experiments with induced pluripotent stem cells show that even ordinary adult tissues can be reprogrammed back into embryonic states, cells once differentiated into identity dissolving into youthful potential again. Research on telomerase hints that the capstones of our chromosomes, normally eroded by age, can be lengthened, rewoven, restoring divisions that seemed impossible. Mice in laboratories have been rejuvenated with partial reprogramming, their tissues winding back into vigor, their lives extended. None of this is yet the miracle of truly backward life, yet each step suggests the same principle. Aging is not entirely forward, its mechanics contain loops, detours, and perhaps even exits. To see these patterns in nature is to realize that the human longing for reversal is not so much a rebellion against nature but a reflection of its deepest rhythms. Time in the living world does not always rush forward like a river. Sometimes it eddies, swirls, retreats upon itself. Trees drop leaves in autumn, dying in appearance, only to bloom in spring as though time itself had reversed them back to youth. Forests burn in devastation, only to send up shoots from the very ashes, green tendrils reclaiming the ground as though the past were replaying itself into renewal. Insects cocoon themselves, dissolving into nearly amorphous forms only to break out reborn, colors brighter, wings unfolding like an entirely new birth spun from what had been. Nature has always contained the pattern of reverse aging, if not in the strict cellular sense, then in symbolic waves of renewal, collapse, and return. It is perhaps within these patterns that one finds a bridge between imagination and natural truth. To imagine backward-moving humans is not to create something completely foreign, but to magnify what the rest of the living world already contains, cycles returning, births hidden in endings, innocence reborn from wisdom. The circle is as much nature's law as the line. Time expands outward in loops and returning spirals, not only darts forward like an arrow. By contemplating natural analogies, we see to strange comfort within ourselves that even if we do not live backward, in a way, all things already do. Yet this reflection also forces another question: if the universe is filled with such echoes of renewal, why, then, is humanity locked so stubbornly within the one-way current of aging? Perhaps the answer rests not in biology alone, but in the meaning we draw from time. Human beings crave narrative. We need beginnings to lead to middles and middles to culminate in ends. Our sense of story, of identity, of legacy insists on the line. Nature may cycle, but human awareness desires structure, and so the arrow of aging serves our psychology as much as our biology. Reverse aging may, in reality, already exist in fragments within us, resurfacing in cellular reprogrammings and regenerative hints, but our consciousness interprets time in such a way that the arrow is always forward, never bent. This is why imagining complete reversal rattles us deeply. It does not just alter biology, it alters the core of narrative itself. What becomes of a story when it does not accumulate but dissolves? What becomes of history when it does not build but evaporates? Here again, natural comparisons guide us. A caterpillar dissolving into chrysalis seems to lose everything, its tissues broken down to primal cells. Yet when it emerges, it is not loss but metamorphosis. The past is not annihilated in that rebirth but rearranged, reinterpreted. Perhaps, then, reverse aging in humanity, if it were possible, would not be meaningless regression, but a kind of metamorphosis lived in reverse, a revelation that both backward and forward are illusions, and that what matters is the rhythm of becoming itself. From another angle, we may look to cosmic phenomena. Stars die not by fading alone but by collapsing and igniting again. Supernovae burst, scattering elements into space, seeding new systems, perhaps even new life. Black holes evaporate slowly, curiously, perhaps returning energy to the cosmos after eons. The universe has never moved in one direction simply. It contracts, expands, folds, and unfolds upon scales far beyond comprehension. If galaxies can collapse only to give birth to others, why should life not mirror such cycles? Humanity may imagine its arrow of time, but the cosmos itself hums in waves of beginning folded into ending. Societies in the reversed world we have been building in this reverie might themselves take these natural analogies as sacred lessons. Cultures might tell myths not of linear progress but of cycles drawn directly from forests, seas, and skies. Temples might depict jellyfish as icons of immortality, trees as sacred texts of rebirth, butterflies as allegories of timelessness. Farmers would keenly feel the seasons as metaphors of human life, for backward aging aligns with nature's outward appearances. Leaves shrivel at the beginning of winter like fragile births, then bloom into strength and lush youth by spring. A reversed humanity might see itself not as strange, but as perfectly fitted to the seasonal pulse of the earth. This would naturally affect the arts, the songs, and the philosophies of such people. Poems would not lament the losses of dementia, but celebrate the holiness of forgetfulness, likening it to leaves returned to soil. Songs would not glorify accumulation of wisdom but the innocence of spring's return, the same way cherry blossoms bloom not as symbols of permanence but of fleeting, cyclical beauty. Philosophers would sit by rivers, meditating on the way water doubles back on itself in eddies before continuing downstream, taking it as proof that such loops mirror the human condition more than progression ever could. And yet, in our own world, though we are not biologically backward, we already see this resonance with nature helping us find peace. We already celebrate renewal in holidays aligned with spring. We already embrace the shedding of burdens at certain stages, rituals of forgiveness, of rebirth, of release. Perhaps without realizing it, we mirror the backward logic of time even as we age forward, because something in us knows the cycle is more real than the line. The more deeply one descends into this meditation, the clearer it becomes that the Benjamin Button vision belongs not only to human fantasy but to the universe at large. Nature's creatures, its patterns, its seasons, its stars, all demonstrate that life is not constrained to forward arrows alone. The backward imagination is simply human consciousness remembering what the cosmos has always done to collapse and renew, to begin where others end, to erase and rebuild in endless loops. As these thoughts unfurl gently, slowly, steadily, they cease to feel like argument and melt into lullaby. The mind imagines a jellyfish curling backward into youth, a butterfly breaking from its cocoon like time reversed, a forest pierced by fire only to resurrect itself in blossoms, a star bleeding brilliance only to scatter life across empty space. Each fragment of natural renewal becomes an image of serenity, a reminder that all things are in motion, all things pass away and yet return in another form. Whether human life is forward or backward, whether our cells decline or unspool into youth, the greater truth is that time is never still, never simple, never one way. And so, as night deepens, the listener drifts with these images, drawing calm not only from the fantasy of backward humans but from its reflection across every corner of existence. Time runs forward for us, backward for our imaginations, and in cycles for all the rest. The mind, resting in these harmonies, yields to the tender rhythm of nature's song, letting go of anxiety, letting go of urgency, surrendering to the eternal return. And as silence grows, as thought itself laps like waves against the shore, the soul drifts gently toward the quiet warmth of sleep, carried by the reassurance that in every direction, life remains a mystery both fragile and endlessly beautiful. As we let the long journey of imagination reach its closing span, it feels as though we have walked in slow circles through an unfamiliar world, one where the arrow of time itself has dissolved and human beings live, quite impossibly and yet beautifully, in reverse. From the very beginning of this thought experiment, we stepped into the moment of birth, not with eyes wide and innocent, but with bodies already carrying the frailty of years, a paradox that startled the heart and mind. We moved carefully into the intricacies of biology, into the mysteries of cells, tissues, organ systems, all unraveling only to renew themselves in rhythms that bypass the ordinary destiny of decline. We turned through the corridors of medicine, explored the complex weight of families who cradle ancestors in newborn faces, drifted into societies that honor infants as sages and record their fleeting wisdom before it vanishes into laughter. We built worlds of culture reshaped, watched religions reimagine endings as beginnings, watched economies redesign themselves around wisdom lost and innocence gained. We even peered outward into nature and the universe, seeing in jellyfish and forests and stars reflections of this impossible reality, until nothing any longer felt strange, only familiar in its quiet cycles. If we lean one last time upon this vision, stretching it across every dimension of life, its meaning deepens as though we are looking into polished glass. The idea of reverse aging, when first mentioned, shimmers with strangeness, something almost comical or unbelievable. But once walked through carefully, it becomes a mirror reflecting truths about the way life already is. The backward unfolding of time is not only science fiction or mythology, it is the distilled expression of what we already know in fragments but often ignore. That beginnings and endings are intertwined. That wisdom and innocence are equally fragile. That families must always shelter one another in fragility, be it at the start or the end. That cultures exist to preserve what will not last, to remember as much as to forget. And that compassion, above all, becomes the deepest law, because every human passage forward, backward, or cyclical demands tenderness, patience, and care. To imagine people living backwards is also to feel, perhaps even more vividly, the extraordinary weight and beauty of our own lives within forward time. The exercise leaves us calmer, less frightened of age, more forgiving of decline, and perhaps more awake to innocence not as ignorance, but as the final gift of life. Even in backward stories, endings are fragile, beginnings are fragile, and existence is a brief shimmering glow. Whether we are unraveling into youth or fading toward age, the truth does not change. We are passing moments of consciousness wrapped in flesh, fleeting but full of meaning. As the listener lies with these thoughts gently laid around them, it is possible to rest fully in the rhythm of the story. Imagine now the closing images, a newborn resting in a cradle, eyes soft not with ignorance but with the shadow of wisdom, a body already reversing gently into strength, an adolescent glowing with fresh vitality, though their stories have already been told and are now forgotten, a middle-aged citizen laughing with friends while their memories thin, but their heart lightens, a culture gathering around the cradle of a baby whispering truths like ancient scripture, scribes capturing words before they flicker away, a forest renewing after fire, a jellyfish curling back into youth, a star collapsing only to spread life across galaxies. Everything folding into everything else, time bending not forward, not backward, not even in circles, but in waves that rise and fall endlessly. This is the lullaby of existence. Across all these sections, your mind has quietly traveled, and each phase has softened your inner rhythms. The story has woven itself not only across imagination but across your breathing, across the quiet currents of your attention, until nothing feels urgent and everything feels calm. This imagination does not demand answers, it offers the gift of questions, slow and lingering, questions that expand the heart instead of narrowing it. Questions that allow you to surrender fully into stillness. That is the true conclusion of this journey, not a solution, but a state, not clarity, but peace. And now, as we close together, I want to turn from the story itself to you, the one who has listened or read along patiently, allowing yourself to drift gently through these impossible but serene landscapes of thought. I want to thank you for joining me across this long exploration. These words were not just written to explain or to argue, they were written to guide you, to soothe you, to give you something a little like a blanket made from language, in which you could wrap yourself on nights when the mind refuses to settle. You have let yourself wander, and the wandering itself has been the journey. Whether you now drift into sleep or simply into a deeper state of meditation, I hope that what remains is a feeling of calm, a sense that time flows in many shapes, but that all of them are beautiful when seen gently. So as this story, as this voice, as this long dream comes to rest, I say to you good night. Good night to your questions, good night to your restless thoughts, good night to the forward arrow that can be heavy at times. May you feel how light it can be when you imagine other shapes of time, when you let yourself see that beginnings and endings are only two sides of the same truth. Thank you for walking with me, for dreaming with me, for allowing imagination to serve as your companion tonight. May your sleep be deep, your heart unburdened, and your dreams full of the same mystery that carries the stars, the forests, the seas, and all living things. Good night, my dear audience. Sleep well, and let the tide of time, forward or backward, carry you gently into peace.